So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your host for this one, Karl Smallwood, and it's another video in our new format we're trialling where we get questions asked by you, a member of our lovely audience at home, and submit that question to a member of our writing team, and then have it presented in a script in our usual listicle format. And today, the question we're answering is, does a movie really need to make double its budget in order to be profitable? And the writer who answered this question is one Ian Forty. Follow them at the social media links below, but let's crack on, shall we? So, the internet is full of articles and social media posts asserting that a movie cannot be successful unless it makes at least twice its initial budget. You can find articles positing this all over the place, and it's been written about since at least 2011. Now, the idea that a movie needs to make double its budget to be profitable seems counterintuitive. Common sense would suggest that the moment you cover your costs, everything after that would be profit. How can that not be the case for a movie? The answer to that lies in something known as Hollywood accounting and the various loopholes and non-budgetary expenses and other hidden factors that most Hollywood movies are subjected to. Whatever the reasons are that people say movies need to double their budget, the question remains, is it actually true though? So let's start with just making movie money 101. A movie, as most of us understand it, has a fixed cost. Sometimes that cost rises and a movie goes over budget, as is the case with Waterworld, which still was considered to be a massive flop despite making millions in profit as a result of the fact it went massively over its initial budget, which raised all the associated costs. A movie may have a budget of as little as $30 million, which is a wild thing to say, but consider that, for example, Star Wars The Force Awakens, which is one of the highest budget movies of all time, cost nearly $500 million to make. Now, movie budgets cover the salaries of literally every single person involved. That's the actors, the director, the screenwriter, the cinematographer, the editors, the FX team, sound people, lighting, construction, drivers, animal wranglers, you name it. Just consider, for example, Iron Man 3, which had some 3,310 people credited as being part of the film crew. Art departments alone, which are a major cost factor on things like Marvel movies, can have thousands of people working for them, and all those people need to get paid. After the people are paid, money needs to get paid for actual equipment, cameras, lights, sets, vehicles, clothes, food, everything you see on screen, but also all the stuff behind the camera that you don't see, including, in some cases, the actual camera, which in the case of big budget movies can cost upwards of six figures. As an idea of how expensive professional movie grade cameras can be, companies like Marvel rent theirs. They're that expensive, Marvel, backed by Disney, have to rent them because they're that bloody expensive. Now, once everything is bought and paid for, you can start to make the movie, but keep in mind from the first day you're on set to the day the movie's ready to watch, that can take between a year and 2.5 years. That's the average time for a Hollywood movie at least. People are working and getting paid that whole time, but that's only, to get you halfway there, because once you've got the film in the can, or I guess on a hard drive, you then got to get it to the editing studio, and that's like another huge cost. But then there's the other side, because once you've got the film ready, filmed and edited, there's P&A costs, or prints and advertising. There's general marketing, dubbing, shipping, subtitling and distribution fees. And that's where the big secondary expense comes from, because you've also got advertising, which is not initially part of the budget, but is something that can nonetheless cost as much as the film, if not more. For example, big tentpole releases can have marketing budgets of around $150 million. One example of this is Barbie, which had a $150 million marketing budget on top of a $145 million cost to make it in the first place. Then you've got Marvel's Endgame, which had an advertising budget in excess of $200 million. So basically, if a movie studio happens to be all in on the release of a given movie, then the cost can quite literally double, as was the case with Barbie, which despite having a budget of $145 million, needed to clear at least $300 million at the box office before it started to make a profit. Luckily it did that and more, but there is something we need to consider here, and that is Hollywood accounting. So we're going to start with a story now from the screenwriter of Bohemian Rhapsody, who sued the studio after the movie made about $900 million at the box office, and he didn't see any of that, despite having a deal to receive 5% of the profits the movie would make. The studio countered by claiming that the movie had actually lost $51 million at the box office. The budget for the movie was $55 million, so for the studio's claim to be true, there needs to be about $900 million of extra expenses sunk into that film to somehow make it unprofitable. So where did that $900 million go? And the problem here is that with Hollywood accounting, no one really ever gets to see the books. We don't know where that money allegedly went, but there are, as we mentioned, expenses after a movie is made. Writer Ed Solomon, who wrote Charlie's Angels, Men in Black and Bill and Ted franchise, has gone on Twitter to complain about the fact that Hollywood accounting just kinda sucks. He similarly had a deal for 5% of the profits off of all of those movies and pointed out, despite the fact those are some pretty popular movies that received, in the case of each one, multiple sequels, he has made precisely $0 from any of those deals. Moving in front of the camera, you've got David Prowse, who played Darth Vader, who had a similar deal for a percentage of the profits that Star Wars made at the box office for the movies that he appeared in. And he made precisely, again, $0, because Star Wars apparently didn't make any money at the theatres, at least on paper, which begs the question, how is any of this possible? So we're going to explain with an example, and that example is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which cost about $150 million to make and made about $940 million at the box office, and somehow Warner Bros. Claimed that this wasn't profitable. But thanks to some leaked documents, we know sort of where that money went. So right away, about $150 million was lost to distribution fees, which is fair, right? You've got to distribute the movie. The problem is that Warner Bros. Paid about $212 million in distribution fees to Warner Brothers, specifically another department of Warner Bros. So they paid themselves. So to clarify, Warner Bros. The company didn't really lose any money. They just moved it from one department to another. But by doing so, the department making Harry Potter now had a bill of $212 million to pay, despite the fact that the bill was being paid to Warner Brothers. Then you have the $130 million they claim to spend on advertising. Now the budget's up to close to $500 million. But again, most of that advertising budget was paid to another arm of Warner Bros. They again just moved the money within their own company. But by doing so, now the part of their company making Harry Potter owes out nearly $400 million in fees to itself. But we're not done, because Warner Bros. Also claimed an additional $50 million in expenses for interest paid on the financing for the film. Would you like to hazard a guess at who financed Harry Potter? It was, of course, Warner Bros. They paid the money to themselves, but because it moved from one department to another, they could now, on paper, write that down as an expense. And in the end, Warner Bros. Claimed that Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix somehow had $167 million in losses, despite the fact it made almost $1 billion at the box office on a fairly modest $100 million or so budget. And the majority of that money was spent and paid to themselves. And that's kind of the gist of what's happening with all of these stories. None of these studios are actually losing hundreds of millions of dollars on every single one of their super profitable, successful franchises. It just says that they are on paper, and as a result, they don't have to pay out residual deals to creatives and people in front of them behind the camera and stuff like that. And it's for this reason that there is a running joke in Hollywood that the most creative people are the writers, but the people cooking the books. And all of this is pretty much legal, and there's not really anything anybody can do about it. Studios are well within their rights to effectively pay themselves exorbitant amounts of money for distributing something that they, in all rights, just own. It sucks. And by doing this, moving the money around between departments, they can make even a huge blockbuster appear to be a loss on paper. Likewise, they can take a small film that made no money, shift the money around and make it like a huge success. And for anyone curious about why a company would go to such extreme lengths to make it appear as if every single thing they released was a huge failure, the answer is, of course, they don't want to pay their taxes. Because you don't have to pay taxes on a loss, even if the thing is technically only a loss on paper. But let's move on now to ticket sales. And movies make money by selling tickets. We refer to that as the box office, but box office isn't 100% studio profit. There's one more link in the chain, and that's the theatres. And there's an old belief that theatres don't make any money from ticket sales, and that they actually make it all from popcorn and soda and stuff, and that's why popcorn or soda at theatres costs so much money. That's not really true. The exact amount varies, but theatres make about 50% of the money that a ticket generates, and the other 50% goes to the studio, who, as mentioned, then just shuffle that money around to make it look as if the movie wasn't a success on paper, so they don't have to pay artists and the people actually making the movies. So they do make a considerable amount from concessions, but they make just as much from theatre tickets as well. It's kind of the whole deal. And of course, this varies, and in the past it was different, with studios being able to command a higher percentage of profits on the initial release weekend, and then that amount would taper off and go more towards the theatres as the movie, just kind of dropped off everybody's radar. But those kind of deals don't really exist anymore. Studios also have different deals in place for different markets. For example, if they're in a domestic box office or abroad, Chinese theatres might be able to argue for a greater cut of profits because Chinese censors only allow, I think, 10 movies from foreign markets into their theatres per year, allowing them to basically have studio executives in Hollywood over a barrel in negotiations. But it's they do make quite a bit of money from ticket sales. It's not as much as you think, but it's less than you'd expect. And one thing worth noting here that was specifically brought up by Matt Damon, of all people, on an episode of Hot Ones, is that physical media used to be a huge deal for the movie industry, and it's kind of not anymore for the reasons that we're about to get to in a moment. For example, in 2005, DVD sales and physical media was worth about $25 billion to Hollywood. That's money they don't really see anymore, and as a result, smaller movies are less likely to get greenlit as a direct result of the fact that Hollywood can't expect them to, recoup some of the money they may lose in physical media sales, even though, as mentioned, they can pretty much make anything they want appear to be a loss or a success on paper by just getting the money and going. But they might make slightly less money, and that's not okay. Speaking of making slightly less money, the other thing we need to consider here is streaming. So the monkey in the wrench of how we understand movie money, box office profits, and the whole economy of filmmaking is streaming, a relatively new technology and phenomenon. You could make a strong argument for no one anywhere really understanding how streaming works in terms of the profit that it generates. That includes the people who actually make streaming movies and run the streaming services. Streaming literally does not make any money for many of the people who do it, like Paramount and Disney. And Netflix, one of the oldest players in the game, didn't actually make any money from their streaming service until 2023. Then you have stuff like Apple TV, which is mocked frequently for spending billions of dollars making shows and movies that nobody watches. Netflix gets the same treatment for making huge budget movies that are critically panned and made fun of by their own actors. The company once, for example, spent $55 million on a show it never actually aired. Doug Liman, the director of Amazon's popular remake of Roadhouse, complained about how the streamer treated the film. It was supposed to be released theatrically, but then it got released on Amazon Prime after the studio it was made by, MGM, was bought out by Amazon, who decided to just release it on a streaming service, their streaming service. The problem is that Lehman was under the assumption that it was going to release theatrically, and he had a deal to get a percentage of profits on the back end from box office returns, which obviously didn't happen because now technically the movie wasn't released in box offices, even though 50 million people watched it in the first week. He got nothing. So yeah, and on a streamer like Netflix, a movie is considered to be a success if a certain number of people watch it, and every so often Netflix or Disney Plus or one of the other streaming services will release viewership information to promote one of their films or their TV shows. Prime, for example, boasted that 65 million people watched Fallout in its first 2 weeks. There's no doubt that's a lot of people, but it's hard to find what that means compared to a box office for a movie. If those 65 million people were already subscribers, did Amazon make any money? We don't know because streamers don't generally release that information, and it's not in their best interest to do so because they might have to start paying money to people on the back end. Subscribers is how streamers calculate profit, however, they produce all of these shows and movies or buy the rights to them. So it's really not clear where the money is going or how it's being used. So every month they get your subscription, and that's technically their box office, and then to make more money they need to produce or distribute more films and shows that people want to watch to convince them to subscribe again. Well, in regards to Netflix, they boasted 8 million new subscribers in the second quarter of 2024 for a total of 277 million worldwide, but that didn't include the millions who unsubscribe every single month. Just the nature of the industry requires infinite growth, which is simply not sustainable. Again, in the early years of 2024, Prime said they had 200 million subscribers. But yeah, they also lost several million, as they do every single month. But The corporate machine demands infinite growth. Consider Disney Plus, which had 153 million subs in the same period, but lost over a million in February 2024 when they raised their prices. Which doesn't seem like that many in the grand scheme of things, but a million people randomly not paying you $7 a month is $7 million, and to Disney, that's a lot of cheddar, because they want all of the money. That's the thing, $7 million doesn't sound like a lot of money to Disney, and so you consider Disney wants all of the money all the time. And studios technically can still make money off of the streaming model, just not by being involved with the streamers. They usually do this by selling a movie they already made to a streaming service. For example, Paramount sold Coming to America 2 to Amazon Prime for $125 million, which was double its initial $60 million budget, and they didn't have to pay any of the extra fees we already just talked about, meaning that that movie made double its profit without any real caveats, because as soon as Amazon bought it, all of the pressure to advertise it went straight to Amazon, so they just got to keep all of the cool profit. They made a cool $60 million off their investment and didn't have to think about it any further. But does a movie need to make twice its budget to be profitable? Sometimes, yes, and sometimes the numbers will never make enough sense for us to know, one way or the other, and sometimes there are other routes to making money, like streaming, that can backdoor the process entirely. But realistically, no bugger knows, because Hollywood doesn't want us to know, and it's in their best interest to keep confusing everybody by throwing around wild numbers we can't possibly understand. So thank you to everyone for watching at home. I do hope you've enjoyed this new format. I certainly enjoyed presenting it and learning all the new information contained therein. If you're inclined to agree, you can suggest new topics for our writers to cover in the comment section below, subscribe, all that good stuff. Feedback, suggestions are always welcome. And as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. And maybe this system's not the best system. It doesn't sound like it's a good system. David Prowse, he was Darth Vader. Technically, he was 1/3 of Darth Vader, because he was the guy who physically portrayed Darth Vader. He was in a suit. James Earl Jones was the voice, and then some fencing master was Darth Vader doing the fight scenes. He made no money from Star Wars, besides the initial fee he got paid, which you could argue is fair. He did a job and he was paid for it, but he was promised money on the back end. And the way this works is, because throughout this script mentioned that there's some people who sign these deals expecting to make money, and others who sign them and didn't make any money. And the way it generally works is if you're going to sign a deal to get points on the back end for a movie production, you want a percentage of gross profit, not net profit. Because gross profit is just whatever money the movie makes after its initial budget, whereas net profit is the amount it makes after all of the fees have been taken into account, which, as we discussed, results in movies near universally never making any profit, at least on paper, specifically so they don't have to pay out on those deals. I believe it was Eddie Murphy, speaking of Eddie Murphy in Coming to America, who referred to getting a percentage of net profits as monkey points. And you have to be an idiot to sign such a deal. And he talks about how studios will use the allure of getting points on the back end to convince people to accept lower salaries than they ordinarily otherwise would. And it's only those who have good agents or are in the know who know not to accept a deal for net points, because they know that the studios will never allow a successful movie to make money on paper. They will always do whatever fiddling they need to do behind the scenes to ensure that it does not turn a profit, so they don't have to pay out on those deals. So always go for gross points. Cheers. It sucks, right? It does suck for the actors. And yeah, I guess to end on, one of my favourite stories about an actor being able to take advantage of this, they use their considerable clout to deal a not insignificant blow to the studios, is Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ivan Reitman and Danny DeVito, specifically for the making of the film Twins, for which all three men agreed to waive their usual quite substantial fees in return for, I think they split 70% of whatever the movie made at the box office between them. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger took 30% and Ivan Reitman and Danny DeVito took 15-20% each. And that movie made each of those men nigh on $50-60 million each. And after they did that, studios basically agreed actors aren't allowed to do this anymore. And it was to the point where, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to appear in Terminator 2, Judgment Day, the studio was terrified that he would demand a similar deal and would get potentially hundreds of millions if the movie was as successful as they planned on it being. And when Arnold Schwarzenegger went in to negotiate his fee, his salary for Terminator 2, and he requested, I want a percentage of, like, you know, gross profits, they were like, no, we're not doing that. What else can we give you? Arnold Schwarzenegger thought, went, I would like a plane. And the studio thought and went, okay, what's cheaper? Giving a percentage of potentially all the money Terminator 2 is going to make, or a plane? And it was cheaper to give him a plane. And I believe there was an executive who had a Gulfstream that they were selling cheap, and they gave that to Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that's how he got his private jet. And that just goes to show how valuable those points can be and how desperately studios will try to cling on to them. They will give you a jet if you just shut up and leave them alone. Anyway, cheers, and I'll see you all next time.